We are live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Open Classroom AMED and Women and Gender Studies Open Classroom. The title of the Open Classroom is Gender and Sexual Justice from Kashmir to Mexico, Haiti to Palestine and Zainichi Korean Communities. I'd like to welcome everyone to here. This panel has been co-organized with by Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi and myself, and we have amazing panelists here today, and students from our classes are joining. Dr. Abdulhadi's Comparative Border Studies, Palestine and Mexico, the class, and my Women and Gender Studies course, Women and Gender in U.S. and U.S. History and Society. We are combining those classes, and they're attending here. So I think we'd like to start with land acknowledgement, and then talk about what we are to do in this panel. So I'd like to speak from where I am, and I'm sorry. Actually, Dr. Abdulhadi, could you do it from the land acknowledgement?
Sure. Well, first of all, good afternoon, good evening, مساء الخير, مساء النور, buenas tardes. Other people can also bring in other languages. I don't want to slaughter it, but I want to say that we are San Francisco State, the campus of San Francisco State University on the San Francisco Peninsula and North Bay are located within the occupied territory of the Ramaytush, Ohlone, and the coastal Miwok, who along with Southern Pomo are organized on the Federated Indians of Greater Rancheria. We acknowledge that as stolen, unceded, indigenous lands. And I'm also today on the East Coast on the land of the Lenape, displaced people and uprooted people. And of course, I also come from Palestine, the land of another indigenous people who have been displaced and colonized. We begin by acknowledging and expressing appreciation and gratitude to all the panelists, and you will hear from them. Amazing group of people who have joined us, public intellectuals, activists, organizers, trailblazers, who are really seeking by knowledge, by work, by action to change the world to a better place and institute the indivisibility of justice. We also want to thank our teaching assistants, both TAs, John Payton in Professor Kinukawa's class and Leith Gulum in my class, who have been working with us, and also they are both master students working on their thesis at San Francisco State University. We also want to thank a third person who's been working with us all the time, Salim Shhade, who's a doctoral candidate at UCLA in anthropology, who finished the AMED, his MA and AMED at San Francisco State University. And he's not with us today, but he has helped set up, and you've received the information from Salim. Salim is actually engaged in open classrooms and in other oral histories of Palestinian Arab student activism in the United States at San Francisco State and throughout the world. And we're doing this project, and we will be able to share this with you. I also want to express my gratitude and thanks to my colleague, co-conspirator, comrade, collaborator, Tomomi Kinukawa, who we've been doing this stuff for, oh my God, for at least formally since spring 2020. So I'm going to turn it over to my Dr. Kinukawa, who will actually explain the history. How did we come about? I will also speak about why we're doing this, and then we will raise the question of who is here and ask you. We have with us Leith Gulum is going to be posting on the public chat. We are on Facebook now. He will be Light will be posting. They will be posting on the public chat bios, information, links, and so on. I want to say that I'll come back to that. I will turn it over to Professor Kinukawa now, and then I'll speak about why we're doing open classrooms and what do open classrooms mean. Go ahead, Professor Kinukawa.
Thank you so much, Professor Abdulhadi. It's been just amazing honor to be working with you and also everyone in AMED program and AMED studies. And I would like to like the ways in which we started the collaboration was when I invited Dr. Abdulhadi to guest lecture in my Women and Gender Studies course, and and then she accepted the invitation and then introduced me and students in my classes to teach Palestine and open classrooms, and we've been doing that for a couple of semesters, and 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 I think that it's been a really great success that we've been offering courses on Palestine, queer and feminist gender justice, and yeah, that and sorry, like we did actually offer multiple classes, and each of them was a great success. But that's for one of our classes got censored and silenced by Zoom and SFSU, and so I'd like to say that we have. I mean, it's been just. I mean, it's absolutely amazing experience to be. It's like I mean, experience of learning and feminist work together on in the very difficult circumstances. And this webinar too, we were afraid that we might not be actually do it at one point, but I appreciate that everyone is here and like we are here on live. And so I think we should talk. I hope that we can talk about like the really difficult hostile environments that we all have to deal with in order to do our work. And we like I say that in the middle of this whole difficulties that we've been facing, and so I'd like to start from there. But yeah, so Dr. Abdulhadi.
Yes, so when we started in spring 2020, actually, Dr. Kinukawa invited me to be a guest speaker in their class, and we decided to make that a big collaboration. And we had two very successful events where colleagues from different parts, students, colleagues, community organizers, because we never ever believed that the classroom is only the classroom for the people who pay tuition. We actually both believe that education should be free. So we're against paying tuition altogether. We would like to be able to open it to everybody. And then the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit us, we had a decision to make. Should we continue or should we basically cancel? Because everybody was struggling and saying this is the pandemic. People who were actually teaching in-person classes had to convert their classes to online. We saw this as an opportunity. And the reason we saw this as an opportunity, because we are on a campus where majority of our students are suffering from financial loans. Some of them are the first in their families to go to college. Some are undocumented. Some are heads of households. Some are juggling so many difficulties at the same time, and so on. It is not likely for San Francisco State University, a public institution, to actually host luminaries such as yourselves and other people we've had. It is very difficult, right before we went into the pandemic, actually we had suffered AMED in two classrooms. We were supposed to be able to have a library room, and one library room was canceled on us, where we were commemorating the Day of Remembrance of Japanese incarceration in concentration camps in Second World War, along with colleagues from the Asian American community, studies community, and so on. And then we were supposed to have another event on Afro-Palestinians, Afro-Palestinian community in Jerusalem, and Black Palestinian solidarity. And that second event, the university was going to shut it down because supposedly the university president and provost were going to tour the library. So we contested it. We said, no, we're going to continue. They're more than happy to come and attend if they'd like to, but we were not going to cancel. And the event was with Emery Douglas, the editor of the Black Panther, the cultural editor. It was with uh, sh- um, Phil Hutchins, who was the chair of SNCC, Student Non-Council Non-Violent Coordinating Committee, when they passed the resolution on Palestine, and it was going to show a film, and it was in a class by my colleague Jamal Dajani, who is a board of trustees of the Arab Cultural and Community Center, and also has a radio show, Arab Talk on KPOO, which is the only black station in San Francisco, which was headed, continued to be headed by the late Terry Collins, our colleague, may he rest in power, who passed away in July. Anyway, so we continued it. So when the pandemic happened, we decided we're going to take advantage of it. Now the world is our oyster. We're going to invite everybody to come and participate and discuss and debate. And we did grade two classrooms. And then when the fall came about, we decided not only to have the classrooms about the people we're teaching about, but to actually invite the people themselves to attend and participate. And of course, all hell broke loose because the Zionists and their right wing white supremacist collaborators, as well as the university neoliberal establishment, had a serious problem with the people we were inviting. We had Layla Khaled, a Palestinian icon, feminist icon. We had Roni Kasrils, who continues to be, but was also a leader of the African National Congress, anti-Zionist Jew. We had Laura Whitehorn, who is a founder of Releasing Aged People in Prison, a former prisoner, spent 14 years in prison, queer Jewish anti-Zionist feminist. We had Seiko Odinga, who was a member of the Black Liberation Army, spent 33 years in prison. And we had the director of the Women's Studies Center at Birzeit University, Rola Abu Dahu, who herself is a former prisoner. And some of you have met her. I see Mamyrah saying, okay, because Mamyrah was part of the Teaching Palestine tour and project in 2018, where we were hosted and we did joint conferences with Birzeit and Najah, and you spoke at those conferences, bringing the experiences of Haiti and Palestine and occupation together. Now, that was shut down. That was shut down by Zoom. It was shut down by YouTube. It was shut down by Facebook. It was groups were threatened that if they carry it live, it would be shut down. But worse than even all of the stuff for us in academic institution is that our university president and provost collaborated with the Zionist agenda with the lawfare and basically threatened us. The provost threatened us that we would be imprisoned, Tomomi and I, if we carried on, even though there was nothing illegal about it. The university refused to support us, and we were unable to do it. And of course, the lawfare project, the Zionist right wing uh, group, as well as white supremacist congressman from Colorado, Lamborn, and others, declared victory and basically chased us, Tomomi and I, to demand that we would be prosecuted on quote unquote accusations of material support for terrorism by the Attorney General, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice. We were supposed to be investigated, according to the New York Daily Post, by the Department of Treasury, by several other departments. And so we spent a month and a half just trying to establish what we already knew, that we were not engaged in material support for terrorism, and this wasn't true. But this has lasted over a year. Now, 2 weeks ago, a faculty rights panel, we took a grievance, was my first grievance. Professor Kinukawa also filed a grievance. We took it to a faculty rights panel that ruled categorically that the university harmed us by not enabling this to happen. They demanded that the university apologize to both of us and that they make it possible for us to have the webinar again, and that they collaborated with the Zionist group Lawfare project. Now, last week on Friday, the university president vetoed the decision that was made by the faculty rights panel, which is very interesting, surprise, about respecting shared governance and democratization and the faculty integrity and so on, and said that she does not accept that. So we are actually protesting that. And the next step will be arbitration. Professor Kinukawa has their own grievance. Uh, they had their own level one meeting, and we will be seeing that as well. I also have another grievance coming up, which will be about the attempt of the universe not only to silence us and shut us up, but in terms of violating our academic freedom and freedom of speech, but also taking systematic, anything but random steps to dismantle the AMED studies program as an institutionalized body that talks about justice in for Palestine, talks about gender and sexual justice, talks about justice, indivisibility of justice for everybody, which is part of why we're here today. Now, the reason we do this open classroom, is because we really want to uphold the spirit of 68, what our students in 1968, led by the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front, started, demanding decolonizing the curriculum, demanding that this university will be open to everybody to participate, demanding that we dissolve the boundaries between the university and the community. You can see where we're going with this, right? And demanding that education should be for all. So we've been conducting, since AMED studies started in 2007, we've been always doing open classrooms. We've been reprimanded, we've been criticized by our dean, saying that classrooms are only for students in the class, i.e. those who pay tuition. We say, sorry, we do not agree. We respectfully disagree. We believe that actually these discussions that we bring together are so encouraging, though so exciting, so enlightening to us, to the panels that come with us, to our communities out there that can hear again and again and again and discuss and think about everything that we had, maybe scripted, but also uncharted grounds. And that's what we really want to do today. And we've had multiple open classrooms that were, and this is probably why we were shut down by Facebook, because we had some of our webinars were attended by 15,000 people. A webinar we had just last month on October 20th, Resisting French Colonialism, commemorating the 60th anniversary of the French massacre of Algerian protesters demanding anti-colonial liberation. We actually started maybe with 50. Now I'm told by Laith that we have almost 700 people attending. So this is continuous, and this is what we're supposed to do. We believe that um, we cannot hold things only within the formal classroom, even though today we have two classes coming together. The other two classes, I have two other classes that students are also invited to participate and attend. One on Edward Said, and one on gender and modernity in Arab and Muslim communities. And Professor Dar, you know, because you've taught that class before at San Francisco State University. And so this was the gender and modernity was in the morning, the collaborator with Professor Kinukawa's class for a panel we did on situated knowledge and critical inquiry. Can the subaltern speak? And we had three Palestinian activist scholars, Manal Hamza, Mahasan Nasir al-Din, and Dareen Tatour. Three of them spoke, and we, of course, engaged with them about their situated knowledge, their production, the book that Dr. Hamza has written about Egyptian revolution and women resisting sexual violence, the film that Mahasan Nasruddin did about the silent revolution, about the history of Palestine, Dareen Tatour's writing about poetry and resisting and being imprisoned and refusing and insisting to write her very well-known poem, Isqawm Ya Sha'bi Qawm, resist my people resist. And she continues to write and she continues to publish. And so it was very exciting, very interesting. And along the same threads, we're doing this our evening, this afternoon panel on comparative border studies. And we are so happy to bring you all together to kind of discuss, debate, what does it mean to do comparative border studies? What are borders? What are boundaries? Are they set in stone? Do we accept colonial boundaries? Do we contest them? What is the struggle of the people? So we want to talk about the repression. We want to talk about resistance as well. We don't only want to talk about repression. So we invited you all, and we're very happy that you joined us. So I'm going to pass it over to Professor Kinukawa to kind of like introduce some of you and actually maybe bring up the first set of questions to ask you to who you are, what you are doing. We're posting the bios, by the way, online, so we don't need to do formal bios, but just a question to start the conversation. Professor Kinukawa.
Thank you, Dr. Abdulhadi. I think you actually did say the question. So like that, I think we'd like to go around multiple times. And so first round, I would like each of you to speak like your work and like how your work relates to the comparative border studies and so can we start from there? And then I think we'd like to make this conversation spontaneous, and so like I'd like us, as a collective, to take it where like we want to. So so perhaps maybe
So we start with Mihye.
Mihye? Okay, sure. Mihye san, じゃあ最初お願いします。So I will try to be translating.
最初は自己紹介みたいなことでよろしいんですか？
はい、お願いします。
じゃあ少しだけ英語で。My name is Mihye Kim. I am Korean, born in Japan. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel today. I am honored to meet you all. First of all, I would like to apologize to everyone for speaking in Japanese instead of English. で、ここからは日本語でもよろしいですか？
はい。
自分のリサーチをしていることからお話しすればよろしいんでしたっけ？
お願いします。
はい。
そう最初の段落に書いてくださったことをお話しくださったら。
はい。はい。今日私の、お話を通訳してくださる私の友人である絹川智美さんからこのパネルのお誘いいただいて、私は英語が話せないということが、大きな壁となって最初は躊躇していましたが、とても今日のこのパネルが、とても大事で貴重な出会いと経験ができるのではないかと思って一大決心をしました。英語も喋れないのにこういうパネルに出るということは本当に一大決心だったんですけれども、この場に参加するということは私にとってはとても大きなチャレンジでした。で、以前にもともみさんは、私に何度かアメリカでの研究会やシンポジウムに誘ってくださったんですけれども、今お話したように私に英語の壁があるという問題と、で何よりもまずその私の国籍の壁によってアメリカへの入国がとても難しいので、お断りをしてきたということがありました。私は朝鮮籍の在日朝鮮人でパスポートがないからです。なので今日私がこのようにパネラーの一人として参加することができたのは、大変皮肉な話ですけれども、世界的なコロナのパンデミックによって多くの会合や会議がオンラインとなったことで、パスポートがなくても物理的に国境を越える必要がなくなったから参加ができたと思っています。
じゃあそこで訳しますね。So let me translate. So he was talking about like how like when actually I invited her to speak on this panel, initially she was very much reluctant because she is not well. She said she cannot speak English, and so but then she was thinking that this might be a really amazing opportunity to meet with all of you, and so it's been a really huge decision for her to be here, and in the past, actually, I did invite Mihye a couple of times, multiple times, to participate in the symposium and panels in here. However, that she was not able to come here, partly because of the language issue, but mostly because of her nationality. She calls it like because of the nationality as a kind of a wall or hindrance, and she cannot enter U.S. because of she has Chosenseki, which is it sounds as though it's nationality, but it is not, and she will explain that to us later. But because of that, she has no passport, and so she feels it's very much ironic that she's able to participate in this panel because of pandemic, actually, and everything is online, and so the physical movement is not necessary, and so that actually made it possible for her to participate in this panel. I'm wondering, should we continue, or I think Mihye could tell us what Chosenseki means and so forth, but
maybe Mihye can just tell us where you're coming from and just explain the issues that you're dealing with, some of the struggles, briefly, before we move to the next person.
皆さん、短くもう少し皆さんのバックグラウンドと、それからどういう困難に直面しているのか、かいつまんでお話ししてくださいますか。
はい。じゃあ私のお話でよろしいですかね。
はい。
今お話ししたように、朝鮮籍ということで、これは、国籍では、ナショナリティではないんですけれども、どういうことかというと、日本に、暮らしている、在朝鮮人の、多くは歴史的にはもともとその朝鮮籍という朝鮮半島出身者たちを、外国人登録する際の便宜上に使われている一つの記号です。なので私はさっき言ったようにパスポートがないということで移動に非常に不自由がある、制限がある。でただ私たち朝鮮籍ということは結局民族的な朝鮮民族全体への帰属意識というのがあるんですが、朝鮮半島が、ご存知の通り南北に分断されていて、我々は常にあなたはノースなのかサウスなのか北なのか南なのかということをよく問われるんですけれども、私は必ずしも朝鮮籍だけではなく多くの在日朝鮮人が、韓国籍の方も含めてあるいは日本に帰化した方も含めて国籍はどうであっても一応、問題意識としては朝鮮半島の統一を願ったりしている在日朝鮮人にとってはいわゆる本当にそういう意味でのボーダー、国家として国民国家として北なのか南なのかあるいは日本なのかとかいうそういう国民どこにあなたは帰属意識を持っているのかっていうことを常に問われる、そういうことが一方ではありました。で、私はまた両親が韓国の済州島の出身で両親2人とも50年代に密航をして日本に渡ってきたというバックグラウンドがあるので長らく実は、私は1967年生まれですけれども1975年まで私の両親はずっと不法滞在者として身を隠してずっと日本の社会に息を潜んで生きていたという経緯がありました。なのでそういう経緯からあって私は現在も永住権在日朝鮮人に与えられていた一応すごく制約的なものですけれども特別永住という永住資格がありますが 私の場合は両親が密航者だということで、そのような、資格がないという、ところで、なんとか在日朝鮮人を続けているというか、私の一つのこの実存として、抵抗として実存的に在日朝鮮人を生きるということを、とても意識的に最近、考えているという感じです。はい。
ありがとうございます。So let me translate. So she was explaining about like what Chosenseki means, and Chosenseki is not a nationality, but it's a category that was created by after the World War II, by the new alien registration law, and it's a category that was used for all people from Korea people who moved from Korea under Japanese colonial rule, and then who stayed in Japan. And since this is actually just a code and not a nationality, she's not able to actually move around like freely. So she talked about how so that's she was talking about how, like, that she'll be able to move over. So that if she could actually get the South Korean nationality, she would be able to. The Koreans who actually decided to get the South Korean nationality, they had more rights and privileges in Japan, but because like she and her family do not have South Korean nationality either, they are minorities within minorities in Japan. And she talks about like how she was always asked about whether she belongs to North or South, and that question has been imposed on her throughout her life, and also her parents are actually from southern part of islands in southern part of Korea, but they came to Japan illegally, and so they had to live in Japan, hiding, and they try to kind of try to remain very quiet so that they won't be revealed, and so that's that's also the reason why she was not able to actually get special permanent permanent resident status, which many Zainichi Koreans actually have received. So she's been kind of thinking about how being Zainichi Chosenjin and living as Zainichi Chosenjin is a kind of a form of resistance, and she's been thinking about like the political meaning of her being existence as Zainichi Chosenjin.
Thank you. Thank you, Mihye. Thank you
Thank you.
for mentioning this. I think this is kind of like raises questions of the history which students do not know, and we don't. I mean, the problem is that we don't have enough time in this panel to talk about it. But I think also it relates to the U.S. and it relates to the quote unquote Cold War. It relates to the so-called Korean War. It relates to the U.S. actually criminalizing, but also it relates to the history of Second World War and the ways in which communities who are criminalized in the US are also there is kind of like the contentions and the contradictions of what does this mean. In the US, we actually have been in AMED very much working on every year on the Day of Remembrance around the incarceration of Japanese people in concentration camps in the Second World War, Japanese Americans and people of Japanese descent. And then we also have been working around the whole question of the Korean, quote unquote, Korean Comfort Women Justice Coalition and thinking about what does this mean when there is an oppression within oppression going on and how do we deal about it. So I think maybe we can come back to that, but I think maybe now it might be kind of apropos to kind of like go to Mamyrah and talk about the whole question of what does the whole question of the construction of borders and boundaries. I mean, you study Haiti and you focus on Haiti, and Haiti was the first Black Republic in the Western Hemisphere, which was actually a revolt that doesn't really get mentioned a lot. And then the whole question becomes about immigration, migration, the role of the U.S. in supporting Tonton Macoute and Baby Doc Duvalier and Doc Duvalier, and the whole question of what's going on sort of goes out the windows, and it becomes also it's sort of the whole struggle gets constructed about are people going to be let in into U.S. or not, and everybody who owns the debate is discussing it as if the people who are discussing are actually the ones who own the U.S., not the indigenous communities who are in the U.S. I was wondering if you can just like speak about all these issues whenever you want to talk about them and kind of like deconstruct borders, boundaries, racism, white supremacy, colonialism, and so on. Sorry, it's a lot, but
It's
take
a
it away.
big job you just
Yeah,
gave
of
me
course,
there.
of course, of course.
Well, I wanted to say that first, my work centers on social movements in Haiti, right? So, and relatedly centers around right what they're organizing and raging against, right? So, state abandonment, state corruption, all of which are connected to neoliberalism, racial capitalism, the erosion of territorial sovereignty. What's happening a lot, especially since the 90s and accelerated after the earthquake in 2010, are land grabs, right? So I talk often about the recolonization of Haiti, particularly in 2004, but intensified in 2010, since most people think about, that first earthquake. And instead of reconstructing Haiti with the funds that much of the world had donated, those funds went to support, really subsidize, for example, industrial parks to produce clothing that a lot of us here, right, in the global north are wearing, from Gap, from Walmart, Old Navy, etc. Right? And so that's some of the conversations that we're not hearing about. What has happened really that didn't lead to this reconstruction. My work also looks at the destruction of national production, right? So with this neoliberal turn that we're seeing accentuated in the 90s, part of what the US is doing, right, is saying, well, Haitians should concentrate on finding something to sell, on the open market, right, on the global market, and not concentrate on producing their own food, which makes them dependent on buying food from guess who, right? The United States itself, but primarily rice coming out of Arkansas, right? So people are fighting against all of these things, right? Recolonization, so violence against women, violence that's both coming out of the occupation of Haiti that really starts in 2004. And it is a very different kind of occupation than what we saw a century before, in 1915, when you saw really U.S. white Marines coming in, primarily out of the south of the United States, where Jim Crow law was in effect, right? So they came and they colonized the land, and obviously they didn't just come in order to dominate militarily. It came also with an economic agenda. But when we look at 2004 moment, and this really speaks to, right, some of the challenges that I pose to South-South cooperation and relations, where we see that Brazil and Chile, Latin American countries, both of which at that point are led by left-leaning governments, are very happy because they are vying for power on the global stage to lead a United Nations occupation in Haiti, right? So these are some of the differences that we see in, a century apart. Of course, the US is operating at the top from the US Embassy, and they're essentially controlling the elections, and they want more favorable governments who are going to be leaning away from Cuba, leaning away from Venezuela, and going to continue the plantation system that has always existed in Haiti since 1492. Well, especially since 1600s on, because 1492 moment when the Spanish first come, they're more interested in extracting the gold, right? Not necessarily plantations, but the idea of a place where you keep taking things away from the land, right? Whether it's atop the land or underneath it, is the logic of colonization for Haiti, right? Since its beginning, and using first the indigenous populations, and when they've been decimated, bringing in Africans to work the land, right, as the cheapest form of labor. So we see that this struggle continues on well into today. And so why I bring up the occupation is also that what we're seeing is social movements are fighting against violence against women. And when we see what occupations do is that they target women, obviously, and they rape children, they rape girls, they rape boys, they rape women. And part of that is to break the back of the resistance of women, for example. And in the most recent phase of this colonial moment, and it's not because that didn't exist before, but because we have groups that are identifying around such categories. In Haiti, they call what we call LGBT here, people refer to it as Communauté M, so the M community, and it's another series of acronyms that reflect sexual categories that are existing in Haitian Creole, right? So speak to a reality that is Haitian, which is a way to push against this concept that somehow non-normative sexualities come from the international, right? And there we could speak more about that. There are some tensions there, of course, right? But there's also people organizing around the violence against that particular community. So my work really looks at all of these interactions between the organizations and these systems against which they rage and they organize. But most recently, given the US-Mexico border crisis, where more than 30,000 Haitians are still there awaiting asylum in the US after having walked more than 4 months across 11 countries, many of them are coming out of Chile. And, folks are sort of surprised, right? Haitians in Chile walking all the way to the Mexican border. And it's an unusual migration pattern for them because, if people know anything about Haiti, when you think about the 90s, you think about boat people. So folks taking boats, leaving Haiti towards Miami, for example. But now you have this new pattern of migration. And the reason that Haitians are in Chile and Brazil is because of this 2004 moment that I mentioned, right? When not only are these countries looking to Haiti in order to establish, right, some sort of power to say, look, we too can colonize others, we too can occupy others, especially these unruly Blacks, right, from the first Black Republic who rebel all the time, right? But they're also looking to Haitians as cheap labor. So Haitians are migrating, being recruited, targeted, if you will. And I remember being in Haiti myself when I was doing my field work at that time, seeing a whole bunch of young people sitting in front of the airport waiting. And, there were all kinds of brokers, coyotes, who were essentially getting up to $4,000 from them, which meant many of these folks are often selling their lands, right? Or families were getting together to be able to collect that much money. And that was for them to be able to make it to Brazil. That was the first destination, across the Amazon, across the forest, right? And waiting at the border to be let in. And here we're talking about a Brazilian government led by a left-leaning party. And they essentially welcomed the Haitians really as the cheapest form of labor to work on, because Brazil had just won the bids for the World Cup, won the bid for the Olympics, right? So they saw in these Haitian migrants people who could work construction and service jobs, but for a definite amount of time. So when that time ran out, and you also had a change of government, Bolsonaro, right, which is likened to Trump, these folks then started going towards Chile, again towards construction and service jobs. And when Chile got itself turned over to a right-wing government, then they started enacting all kinds of laws to make it more restrictive for Haitians to find jobs or to reunite with their families. And people began taking this very long 4-month trip up. I mean, if we could pull up a map for you to really appreciate how long it takes to walk from Chile to end up at the Mexican border. And of course, there are folks who are stuck at the Colombian border, Colombian-Panama border, people stuck at the Mexico-Guatemala border. and many, many, many more thousands, up to 30,000, it is said, are waiting at the US-Mexico border. And so we ask, well, why, right? Why does this all happen? And I've already pointed to the occupation, but what we see also is that people are responding to these land grabs that have become even more multiplied since the 2010 moment, right? So the state, which essentially isn't working for the population, it's a state that's been put in place by the international community. We see in 2010 the US Embassy coming in and essentially deciding on who wins the elections. And, we think about the US, how people got so upset thinking that somehow the Russians had meddled in national elections, but the US, this is their practice to decide single-handedly who leads any country, that is in order for that particular state to be favorable to the policies that the US wants. So essentially they choose these folks who, again, take the Reconstruction money, they take all kinds of state money, tax money, and they support multinational companies and their plans for supposedly creating jobs on land that could produce food. Right, so these are agricultural lands that are not empty, right? So you see this logic, this colonial logic, right? And part of my work looks at the laws and looks at also the documents that are being produced and the ways that they're talking about the people as young, right, and needing work, and speaking about them as though they were doing subsistence farming, right? So these are people who are not engaged with the market and they're being unproductive with the land, right? This is all the kind of language that we know has been coded to essentially justify the land grabs that we see that has produced what we call today the United States, right? That they were being unproductive. And this is the same kind of language that the state is putting in their official documents that is matching with the international financial institutions. And essentially they're using that to take the land from folks. So either convince them to sell towards saying, you're going to now have jobs in these factories, right? And be able to now become modern citizens, right? And have access to the good life. Or they're tricking people, right? So you have many folks who've been living on the land for hundreds of years who don't need to necessarily know how to read or write, or if they do even, they're not interested in engaging a state that has been traditionally violent towards them. And so they don't have the paperwork. And that becomes a way for the state to remove land from folks. So I think what's emerged as very important is the use of the law, right, legal documents in this process of colonization and recolonization. And we see it since 1492. When Christopher Columbus arrives, right, he has the papal bulls that gives him the right to take over that land. And throughout the history of Haiti and colonialism at large, there are always these laws that are justifying the separation, all kinds of borders, right? The separation of people racially. And in the case of Haiti, I will just point out, since this is a recent development, right? For example, in the recolonization of the Caribbean by the United States in the early 20th century, you have the drawing up of the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which really hadn't existed before 1929. And you see in 2013, the Dominican Republic going back to this 1929 date in order to claim that anybody who had been Haitian prior to that date would be officially, whose ancestors were Haitian, even if they were Dominican today, would be denationalized. So using the law to enforce, borders is extremely important. Using the law to enforce these land grabs is extremely important, right? Even if there is brute violence also being committed, the law becomes this important tool that has to pre-exist before we even see some of this violence enacted. I think that's an important piece to raise, and we see this is what's taking place right now in Haiti, which we can go a little bit more into the details of today, and related to this migration crisis that we're seeing all over the Americas. But the Dominican Republic has essentially shut down the border, shut down commercial flights, even revoked the student visas of Haitians studying in the Dominican Republic, has closed down the binational market at the border. And essentially, this is towards, right, the security of their country against Haitians, as they suspect that Haitians will be attempting to leave the country yet again in another wave, because of the upsurge of gang violence in Haiti. We use the term gang. I've been pushing folks to think about them as paramilitaries, because again, in a country like Haiti, and many of us know the indexes of poverty there, Haitians are not growing guns out of the ground, right? So they're certainly buying them, and we know the U.S. is one of the number one arms traders in the world, and certainly that region. And so, where are these folks getting these guns, right? They're coming from the Dominican Republic border. They're coming from the ports out of the U.S., and these folks are turning their guns against the population at large, kidnapping people, raping people, right? So we're not necessarily seeing an imperialist army of white supremacists in Haiti, right? But we're seeing, the instrumentalization of young males who are who are frustrated, right? Who have been marginalized by society and who've turned to this as a solution to access, right, masculine power, really. In a country where they see the men at the top being able to enjoy the riches of the state, right? Or the bourgeois men who are able to reap the benefits, by being middlemen, merchants, industrialists, etc. So these men are looking for access to that type of power as well. Anyway, so I can go on, but I'll stop there to give a chance to other folks to introduce themselves and talk about their work.
So thank you, Mamyrah. I was really struck because when we were in Palestine, you kept talking about comparative occupations. And so in the Palestinian context, everybody knows, or at least thinks they know what occupation is all about. But then when it came to Haiti, actually it was really very insightful to focus on that. So I think I'm gonna just signal a few points that we will come back to. The whole question of quote unquote industrial productive zones, which is something I could speak about, but also the whole question about the ways in which there was the discourse. It's hidden now. It's not so overt because we don't have Trump in power, but the whole thing about all these people are stealing our jobs, and it's all these people of color that come from SH countries, right? Stealing their jobs and so on. So I would just kind of like remind us that this is not far long, and just because it's no longer in public headlines, it's there, right? It's part of it. I was also thinking about when you were talking about the people marching from Chile, I was really thinking about what are comparative possibilities to think about that and the Great March of Return that Palestinians instituted. Is there, comparative studies always implies that everything is the same, always. But is there basis for comparison? This is something we can come back to when we think about where do we go? What directions do we go? How do we think about this? I was thinking about the ways in which the Dominican Republic is either willingly or forced to actually implement and institute the wishes of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the US, and the international power structure. How does that work? And where is the political economy in all of this? Because I think a lot of the time political economy sort of escapes and people only think about quote unquote human rights violations. And we really need to feel sorry for our quote unquote fellow human being. And this is not where all migrants are welcomed and so on. It's just all of it becomes kind of like generalized that doesn't really have any material basis, because people can say whatever they want. At the end of the day, if conditions don't change, it's going to keep reproducing the same thing. I was thinking about kind of like what you said about imperialist. What is an imperialist country or not an imperialist army, and who's doing this? And even I was also thinking about even my own research about the whole question of quote unquote gang violence. And we had Shabab during the end of the quote unquote first intifada of young men who were actually supposed to be resisting the occupation, but then one of their main people who were supporting them, Abu Jihad, was assassinated by Israel. And all of a sudden there is no money anymore, but they're only trained. They haven't been sufficiently pedagogically and politically engage in what is it, what's, kind of like Fanonian discussion and so on, or Malcolm X, why is violence? To what ends violence? Violence is not for everything, and violence is not necessarily the first option, and violence is not necessarily the most feminist, but there is ways to think about it. So I think these are kind of like issues that the reason I'm mentioning this is I'm actually thinking about, okay, so what would be our next conversations, not only today. Think about that. How do we? And my last question, I guess, would be when we come to that is that why is it that people do not recognize what's going on in Haiti as part of what's going on about borders, about boundaries? But there is this kind of like, I guess, very insidious and white supremacist, racist, benevolent approach that, oh, please come, kind of like, I mean, honestly, this is for me, it's more offensive than even people who say stay, go back. I mean, to me, it's kind of like, what is this? And so how do we even think about the histories? And I'm very much informed by the discussion we had last month when we had Felix, who was speaking about Haiti and the connections of the Caribbean, African connections to what happened in Algeria, to what happened to French colonialism, empire, and so on, connecting French empire to US. And I'm just thinking about kind of like, how do we do that? That's maybe part of the things we'll come back at the end. I'm going to turn it over to Tomomi, my colleague Tomomi Kinukawa, Dr. Kinukawa, to kind of like introduce Huma and move the conversation along.
Yes. So so I'd like to introduce you, Huma. Are we sharing the bio in the
Life is posting the bios on Facebook, so we don't really have to do that. Just
Yeah. So yes. So please tell us about your work, and we've been reading and signing the letter that you sent to Duke University Press, and I think that's, if you could share that your experience, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. I would actually like to first thank Dr. Rabab and Dr. Kinukawa for inviting me here and for gathering this wonderful gathering. And also to do a quick land acknowledgement. I'm based in Berkeley, which is actually the Loshan village of the Chochenyo Karkin Oloni people. And it is my ability to be here on this land, to live and to work, that allows me to do the work that I'll share with you. And that I have learned a ton by thinking with them. So we learn from each other, and in that indivisibility of justice that Rabab, Dr. Abdulhadi has talked about, written about, that has been so productive in a concept. It's not just a responsibility to think of injustices everywhere in the world, but it's also liberating. It's also a right, because we realize that wherever our human beings are hurting, wherever creatures are hurting, and especially human beings are hurting, and there's injustice, we have a right to justice. We have a right to connect it to justice throughout the world, and we have a right to be heard. And it's in that context, and it's some of the things that we have already talked about, the problem of oppression within oppression, or problem of what in the case of Indian occupied Kashmir usually comes to is brown people oppressing other brown people. And so I read it as a sign of white supremacist racism that does not want to engage in the history, in the politics, in the of the colonial occupation, which is incrementally genocidal, because it's the lack of interest in brownness. It's a lack of interest in those, those people down there in South Asia, and God knows they must be savage in some way to be enacting this violence on each other, and we don't really need to know too much about it. And the question really is colonialism. The question really is occupation, and in that aspect, it is simple. It's all about occupation, right? And so when we talk about comparative boundary studies, border studies, occupation studies, coloniality, that is the key to understanding and our experience in Kashmir, where the colonialism didn't just start from the Indian when the British left British India, and I'm calling it British India because in that form, no such country ever really existed before the British had created this conglomerate of British India. But our colonization goes back to 1586 when we were first colonized by the Mughals, who happened to be Muslims. But the questions that you've asked me about the letter, I actually did not write that letter. I gave suggestions, I gave some advice, I did some research and sent some links about the problems with the scholarship of this particular professor, Saiba Verma at UC San Diego. And so the quick story about that is, and this is also something like I have learned in the ground. I've learned on the ground with our indigenous scholars when we were thinking about Professor Andy Smith and talking about decoloniality, talking about feminist ethics, decolonial ethics of doing work in oppressed communities. So the foundational importance of transparency, the critical importance of a full disclosure and honesty and a relationship of truth and honesty with the subjects, not just the subject that you are questioning and interrogating in a vastly inequitable, unbalanced situation of power. So in this case, she was a PhD student at Cornell University when she started her research on mental patients in Srinagar, Kashmir. And so honing into the most vulnerable people of an occupied land, where the trauma of massacres and gang rapes and mass rapes, when entire villages of people of all gender and all ages, from 8-year-old girl to an 87-year-old man, are raped by the Indian Army in one night. You can imagine the trauma. And it's not even PTSD. It's not post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a continuing stress because the army is there in greater and greater numbers. Kashmir is on the Guinness Book of World Records as the most militarized occupation in the entire world. And so this person goes there, works with, enters into clinics. And I first met her in 2011 at the largest South Asian conference that occurs in the United States, which is at Madison, Wisconsin. And we were on the same panel. And I just found, even from her abstract and what she presented, and I asked her there and then that, you really need to, how do you deal with your being an Indian? And she was very explicitly, very transparently an upper class Indian. How do you deal with the immense disparity in power that you would have with these people who are coming in distress at the only mental health institute in Srinagar in Kashmir? And so she actually didn't respond. She never responded to my questions. And earlier this year, we found out that, her dissertation, that was 2011. She got her PhD in 2013. And I always wondered how she got her IRB approval. How did she get her institutional review board approve it? If she's not being transparent to us, how is she transparent to the patients in Kashmir? Her book that emerged from that same research was out last year in October, and it's called The Occupied Clinic. And it's distressing because there is nothing in the book about her positionality. There's no transparency. She does not do it. I think she mentions twice that she is an Indian. And therefore, the soldiers who really look at with rapacious gaze at Kashmiri women, and I'll add to that Kashmiri men and women and all genders. They look at with all genders, all people in Kashmir with that rapacious gaze because they've raped all of us. And she says that they don't look at her that way. And I'm wondering, how does she assume that they know she's an Indian, A, and B, how does she deal with that? How does she deal with that imbalance? Earlier this year, we found out that her father was actually working with the research and analysis wing of, which is the premier intelligence agency of India. And it's also the same intelligence agency that in the 90s, when the armed movement for liberation started in Indian occupied Kashmir, they started an immense genocide, including the structuring of counter-insurgent militias, informal militias who massacred and killed rampantly, and particular forms of torture. And as another comparative construction, there are positions of torture that the Indian army has used on Kashmiri people that are called the Palestini position, the Palestinian position. And I believe they've learned those from the Israeli counterparts. And a lot of the technology, the drones that are flying right now in the cities, in each and every city, there are drones that are flying, government drones that are flying, trying to catch people as soon as they come out. They're using facial recognition technology so that the moment I emerge out of my house, or if they can even see me from my window, they know my whereabouts and they know what I'm wearing. They know who I'm talking to. They know what I'm doing. So back to this person, she had never been transparent about that. She had acknowledged her dad for opening up, and I'm citing, opening up Kashmir to me and opening up the world of documents for me under your own care, end quote. This was the acknowledgement to her dad in the very high up person in the Raw agency in her dissertation. In her book, it is, thank you for letting me learn the love for books, and as well as for fighting fighting with grace. And I'm wondering, what is a Raw agent who is inextricably involved in the genocide of Kashmiri people? What kind of fight is he engaging in with grace? It's actually really disturbing. And so we wrote there was an anonymous thread on Twitter that was that came out, that somebody formed a new account and they posted a long thread on Twitter in the middle of October last month. Since then, it's been all hell broke loose, and that thread talked about why they were keeping their names anonymous, because they're younger grad students, younger scholars, and they already fear the intelligence agency, as we all. I mean, I hope you guys know how the censorship of internet and the censorship is so intense that students are charged with sedition and terrorism for cheering for the victory of Pakistani cricket last week. They are thrown in jails. The lawyers are not ready to fight for them in Agra, India. Students within Kashmir have been rusticated. Medical students who were seen cheering for the victory are arrested, and they're in jails. And there are videos available of BJP, the current Hindu nationalist party in power, their politicians talking about, well, we're going to take away all their degrees, that obviously, but these people should be skinned alive. That's the language that they're using, of skinning us alive. And it does raise hackles, because we were skinned alive in the last, before 1947, for 101 years, we were ruled by a Hindu Dogra Maharaja in a very colonial manner, and that included being skinned alive and being filled with hay and hung at different bridges within Srinagar, and different landmarks of the country, for the suspicion of having eaten beef. And it was obviously just to terrorize Muslims, because some of those who were lynched on the suspicion of eating beef were 4 or 5 month old infants who can't eat anything beyond mother's milk. So this Saiba Verma, we wrote a letter to Duke pointing out these discrepancies, that there's no description in the methodology, no transparency. And she, in the Twitter thread, she said, well, I have mentioned I am responsible only to my subjects and to my friends amongst the Kashmiri scholars and journalists, and I have talked to them and they know about it. And at that point, a bunch of Kashmiri scholars and activists who had actually worked with her, who had co-edited things with her or co-written stuff with her, they released another statement saying, we had no idea what Professor Saiba Verma is talking about. We had no idea about her antecedents, and she never shared these with her. And actually, my primary question is, it does not matter if she actually had told her close friends, even if their close friends are 100 or 200. The fact is that that knowledge that she of her conflict of interest, that she comes from a family where the father had worked in Kashmir in the 90s, instituting this genocidal occupation. She was not transparent to, was she transparent to her subjects? Was she transparent to the therapist, to the psychiatrist and psychologist whose therapy sessions she intervened in? And it also made me think, how did she even get permission to sit in on a private, sacred moment, confidential meeting between a therapist and a client? Would we want, if I am talking to my therapist, would I want a third person sitting there? Absolutely not. If my therapist talked about me to another person and revealed my name, absolutely not. That's under the HEPA laws. Why is it that when human beings are being treated like shit in Kashmir, why was it okay for Cornell University to approve such a research project? Why was it okay for them to not ask for her background, not ask for a conflict of interest, not ask for a very explicitly stated, transparent, full disclosure? Because only after a full disclosure can you have an informed consent. Even if the people say yes, and if they're not informed fully, that is invalid. So the research is foundationally flawed, fundamentally flawed in an extremely colonial manner, and it cannot be an honest, innocent mistake, because this said Professor Verma teaches decolonial methodologies, decolonial feminist methodologies at UC San Diego. Are we to assume that she has not read any of the work done by all our scholars here? And Duke University has just sent us a very nothing response. Oh yeah, we listen to you, but how about reading a statement that she has written recently, and the statement she wrote a statement on November 1st. It was posted on November 3rd, and the second paragraph says, "Oh, I've been working with this group of Kashmiri scholars called KSCAN, Kashmiri Scholars and Collaborative Activist Network, and and looking forward to working with them in interest of ethics and so on and so on." She does not reveal that she was kicked out of that group on October 19th. So 12 days before she signed the statement, she had already been kicked out of the group, but she is using that group. I'm a person in that group. She's using us as a fig leaf. She's using us as a foil to show to the academy that she still has some credibility with Kashmiri scholars. So it's really nefarious, and people don't really care. And I've heard academics say, well, this should be taken care of in an academic manner through a review of her book. Like, seriously? it's it's reminiscent of actually what we go through in Kashmir. We get killed and raped and massacred and forcibly disappeared, and then we are told, well, go seek justice, but we're not able to seek justice because out of more than 10,000 people who have been forcibly disappeared, or 11,000 just women who have been raped, there's many more men have been raped as well. Not a single not a single case have we been able to file in the Indian courts because they do not allow it. We are under special powers and special acts from India. Critical amongst them is AFSPA, Armed Forces Special Powers Act. It really is a special power because it grants them the power to kill and rape and torture us with impunity. And 2 years ago, August 5th, 2019, they removed the last figment of legal occupation that they had, where we had mythologically some figment of autonomy, because at that point the autonomy got taken. And although the Congress, the so-called secular party of India, had done its work in whittling away at the autonomy over the last 70 years, but the last the blow came from BJP. And the worst is actually the abolition, the derogation of Act 35A. Under Act 35A, the land in Kashmir could only be bought and sold to Kashmiri people, those who hold subject citizenship. It's been made. It's open for all spectacle at this point. And 2 days ago, there was a news article saying that the Indian government wants to invited bids from corporations, from big corporations, to come and invest in Kashmir, and they got 400 bids. Out of these 400 bids, only 50 were from Kashmiri-owned corporations. And even those are problematic. Many of those have gotten rich through channels of collaborating with the Indian occupation and genocidal occupation. And the rest include things like corporations like the big Ambani and Reliance and Indo-American Synergy Private Limited, whatever. So it does include the diaspora as well. The diaspora is, Indian diaspora is jingoistically invested in an idea where they have their Kashmir, which they call their Switzerland. And that in itself displays the coloniality of the way Kashmir is imagined, their playground, their place where they go to have fun in the Himalayan snow. And the kind of environmental crisis that their colonialism is adding to is not talked about. It is absolutely crazy. They have buried nuclear-powered batteries in certain parts of the Himalayas to do surveillance over China. And that came to light in February this year when there was a big avalanche, a landslide in a part of the Himalayas. And it came out that they were scared that it might have been a nuclear battery that had exploded. It wasn't a nuclear battery, but that's when they confessed that they had buried it in there. And it was both US, CIA, and RAW, Indian intelligence agencies, had buried it in certain face of the Himalayas that face China. So if we know their investment in anti-China discourse. And are we to believe for even a second that they have not buried them facing towards Pakistan? So we're sitting on a landmine. We're sitting on a world crisis situation. I should end so that other people get to talk. But thank you for inviting me and sharing this here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Huma. I think kind of linking up with what both Mihye and Mamyrah have spoken, I think it raises the whole question of the politics of academic knowledge production, accountability. It does raise the question of how do we know what we know and what do we do about it.
Yeah.
It also raises the whole question of South-South cooperation. How do you think about quote-unquote doubly marginalized and so on?
Yeah.
And I think also the bigger question is that how does it work when big powers, the system, is actually using some of our own? to oppress our own. So I want to actually leave that when we come back to talk about it, because when you're speaking, I think one of the issues, and maybe Luna, that kind of like comes to you, is how do we talk about the question of the structures themselves and what they are doing, and the production of knowledge about those structures. Because a lot of the times when we start talking about it, it feels like there is no way out. It feels that, what Foucault said, when power creates, there is resistance. When resistance creates power, there is no way out. And I think, and I kind of like, it looks like that in the academy, because the academy reproduces itself at the end of the day. But what does this really mean then, in terms of kind of like the stuff we do? What does this mean? How do we deal about it? Because there is the whole question of the task of resistance, and there is the task of liberation. And they're not necessarily the same. They're very different, but they're connected with each other. And then the question is, who's the audience? So if you're speaking to a lot of Kashmiri people, we're speaking to a lot of Palestinians, everybody knows what you're talking about. It's like, of course, yeah, I remember this. I remember this. This sounds like this. Sounds like this, and so on. People can identify. There is the politics of identification, recognition, sympathy, and solidarity. But then when you come to actually like figuring out what you want to do, if you're in the academy, it really feels like a straitjacket, because it keeps reproducing itself, and it gives the whole cloak of respectability on people who toe the line, who do not rock the boat. I mean, there is a limit to what you can do, but then you need to stop short of doing something, right? I mean, kind of like, oh, go critique. So what does it mean? Because if you critique, you're reproducing the same thing, which is, this morning we were talking about, can the subaltern speak? The whole question of situated knowledge. So anyway, I think this is something we can talk about when we come to kind of like maybe having our roundtable about what do we do about it? How do we teach about it? How do we research? How do we do it from our positions? Because most of us are in the academy, or at least public intellectuals. If we're public intellectuals, there is something, at least we have a position from which we would do it. Or should we not completely do it and say, to hell with it all? I mean, that's really a big question. It's a philosophical question. I'm not throwing it at you, Luna. I'm just raising it for everybody. If you want to address it, please go ahead, jump at it. But I just want to kind of like welcome Luna. Luna is actually works as an intern with the Center for Constitutional Rights. We met when you were still an intern with Palestine Legal. You were a graduate student, law student at Berkeley, I believe, right? And we met at the National Lawyers Guild. And Luna has been pushing at it back and back and back, and has been kind of like, has the situated knowledge, and has also the intellectual and the critical and the activist commitment to actually speak about these issues. So I'm going to throw it back at you, to Luna, to discuss what you would like to discuss, raise what issues you need to raise, and then we can come back and do the second round about the question of how do we produce all of these other issues, or however you want to talk about it. So I'm going to go for you. Go ahead, Luna.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for inviting me here. Hi, everyone. I'm Luna. I go by she, her. I'd like to first acknowledge that I am in Tenochtitlan, which is the capital of the ancient Aztec Empire. Today, it is known as Mexico City, which is where I grew up and where I am right now. I'd like to also start by saying that I'm not an academic, unlike you all. I did go to grad school, but I don't have a PhD. I went to law school, which is its own kind of worms in terms of knowledge production. I'm speaking more from a position of, first, I'm a lawyer at the Center for Constitutional Rights. It's a movement lawyer organization based in New York that works on challenging structures of power and standing with marginalized communities at risk, and people who have been, historically subordinated. So unlike other more traditional impact litigation places, what movement lawyering means is basically that we are guided by the movements on the ground in our lawyering, that we do not define victory or success primarily by what happens in the courtroom, and that we use litigation and law as a tool of many in supporting community demands in the pursuit of justice. So we don't really think that the law is like an end-all, be-all answer. In many ways, it not only perpetuates, but produces injustice and subordination. So I just wanted to flag that I am not an academic, I'm a lawyer. And even though I did a lot of organizing before becoming a lawyer, that's primarily my contribution to the movement is from the trenches of legal work. When Dr. Abdulhadi first welcomed me to talk at this event, I was trying to come up with something that touches on the themes that we're exploring: colonialism, self-determination, resistance, but also, and I think that she flagged this at the start of today's webinar, not only highlighting the repression, but really also trying to tell an affirmative story and a celebration of our movements and our resistance to show that actually, you know, we are winning. And these efforts at repressing social movements are the ones that are in response. It's not that we are, I think that we often have to work on defending ourselves, and we forget that the tools of oppression are really tailored to resistance and to social movements. They are the ones who are responding to the amazing ground that we have gained, especially in the last few years. I'm going to talk a little bit about Palestine, and I hope that we can sort of like reframe how we talk about these issues as a celebratory story of the movement, and how these bad faith actors are acting in response in order to suppress and silence the work that our communities are doing. So thinking really about an example that brings up how both the sources of our oppression are connected, but also the amazing power that international solidarity has built, I thought that I would highlight the example of the Zapatista struggle as really one of resistance to settler colonialism and also global solidarity among different anti-imperialist struggles. And I'll try to be quick in the hope that other people can, you know, respond to each other, because I know that we're running out of time. I wanted to first give a little bit of background for those who might not be familiar with the Zapatista struggle. I know that this is primarily geared for college students, and they started in the early 1990s when, you know, most of them might not, you know, have been born yet. So back then, Mexico was at the tail end of a 70-year party dictatorship. And that dictatorship, I think, really, you know, sort of casted a doubt in our public imagination about electoral politics as a legitimate form of social participation, which I think is important to understand in when we're talking about the global South context vis-a-vis the US, where I think people still think of electoral politics in the US as an effective form of social participation, right? Whereas my experience in Latin America is that because we have lived for so long in failed states, we don't really have that kind of trust in them. So in response to these many decades of the party dictatorship, there were many clandestine organizations that began to be formed. And the indigenous Maya and Tzotzil communities in the Lacandona jungle, this is in the south of Mexico, it's a state called Chiapas on the border with Guatemala, founded back then the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. Then in 1994, Mexico signed NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with the US. And that's really when the Zapatista Army issued the first declaration of revolutionary law and declared an armed uprising to seize back their land from the Mexican government. And this led to an armed struggle with the Mexican state and paramilitary groups here. I'd like to talk a little bit about Israel's role, which I think this is just one of the many representations where we see Israel as manufacturing the sort of methodology of militarization across the world, really, and how it's connected to other colonial enterprises across the world. In Latin America, Israel has been linked to selling from arms to training of security forces in many of the military coups that, you know, most of you will be familiar with, and that included its involvement in the Zapatista uprising. So the Mexican government dramatically increased its purchase of military equipment from Israel following the uprising from the Zapatistas, and that even included, some military attack airplanes that weren't even allowed under Mexican law back then, called the Araba airplanes, but also contracted Israel to provide training for the military and paramilitary groups that were involved in suppressing the resistance struggle, and those contracts remained in place after the armed conflict with the Zapatistas ended, right? So the Israel got their foot in the door, and then they just remained in contract with the Mexican government. Those same contracts would be later used to purchase unmanned drones to monitor the U.S. border with Mexico. So today we're also talking about the relationship between borderlands and colonialism. Even there, we see the use of first U.S. money to fund the Israeli military, and then the Israeli military weapon system that are then exported to the global south to suppress the population there. So going back to the Zapatistas, there was a period of armed struggle, and finally the state troops retreated. And ever since then, this is the late 90s, the Zapatistas have been living nominally at war with the Mexican state, which basically means that the state has not recognized the legitimacy of their land ownership. But for all intents and purposes, it is a frozen conflict, right? So the Zapatistas still live to this day in autonomy from the state. They have indigenous control over the local resources and, importantly, over their land. And the Mexican, if you enter Zapatista communities, you will see signs telling you a few miles in advance that you're entering the territory that the Mexican government is not allowed, and there will be no armed guards from the indigenous resistance to sort of like ask you why you're trying to enter Zapatista territory. I'd also here like to highlight that what happens when you try to break away from a colonial empire is that you have to come up with an alternative from scratch. And I think that this is often something that we hear from skeptical people or from the opposition itself, is we know that the system is not ideal, we just don't know what the alternative is, right? Like you have to first come up with like a whole utopian vision before we can dismantle the current models of oppression. And I think I want to bring up the Zapatistas because I think it's a really beautiful and inspiring example of coming up from scratch with a new form of social organization, because they, from that moment on, they have had no government support from the Mexican state, obviously no taxes, right? So what this involved in material terms is coming up with a new school system where children could take lessons in both Spanish and their Tzetzal and Tzotzil indigenous languages, a co-op system to hold and distribute the profits from the sale of local goods, which was especially coffee because it's hard to grow food up there, a health system because a lot of these communities are up in the mountains, so you need a mobile health system to support these communities that are not really in urban centers, and obviously a form of governance. So the Zapatistas issued basically a call for solidarity for people from different fields and different places in the world to come support and come help them in what I think some academics have called world making after empire, which I think it's a really beautiful creation that started from scratch here in the Zapatista communities. That's where I first got involved. This was maybe 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Some friends and I decided to respond to this call for solidarity, and my grandfather had been a political prisoner in Chiapas many years earlier. In fact, I spent my first holiday season visiting him in prison there, and throughout the years, my family really continued to nurture a lot of commitment to and love for the struggle for indigenous self-determination in southern Mexico. So in addition to this call for international solidarity, the Zapatistas also have hosted throughout the years many intercontinental encounters and working groups to work on a united platform with other global South struggles that are working against imperialism, neoliberalism, and throughout the years, people have really responded in strength to this call. So if you visit Chiapas today, the closest city to the Zapatista communities, which is called San Cristobal de las Casas, is still today a thriving center of international struggles for self-determination and anti-imperialism, where people have really come together to find those commonalities and work together on some of the solutions in ways that are very, materially visible. It's not just like the vision, but also the implementation, because you see in real time, given that, this is a struggle that has been around for less than 30 years. So it's really starting again from scratch, a new form of governance. And I also wanted to talk about how, one, solidarity has gone both ways. In fact, that the Subcomandante Marcos, who was for many years the leader of the resistance, has stated many times publicly that Zapatistas support Palestinian resistance. He has described the Israeli government's heavily trained military as engaged in a march of death and destruction and a classic military war of conquest, right? So the solidarities, of course, have been connected, but this has come from the recognition that the tools of oppression are connected in very material ways. From the methodology that I talked about to suppress dissent for justice, to the arms and weapon sales used by the Mexican state to suppress these struggles, and importantly, to surveillance technology, which is the last thing that I really want to talk about, is the use of surveillance technology, which some of you all have touched on, to suppress social justice struggles. Most recently, I think this is really relevant to the conversation today, because the Israeli firm NSO, which is a security Israeli firm, it has this malware project called Pegasus that has infiltrated the devices of activists, journalists, nonprofit staff, even political leaders, right? And that has really huge repercussions in terms of our ability to organize in private. So the Project Pegasus, the Mexican government contracted with NSO back then, and NSO, just today, this massive story broke out of how spyware from NSO has been connected to the phones of 6 Palestinian human rights activists that are connected to the organizations that were designated by the Israeli government as terrorist organizations. So this software is used, it might be used in your phones. I would encourage you to just look it up, and they will run you through sort of like a security list, so you can ensure that they're not reading your text, they can track your calls, they can collect your passwords, they can track your location, right? They can really access most features in your phone, including the microphone, the camera, and the information that your apps are collecting. So especially if there are student activists that are listening to this website, this webinar, I think it's important that you just Google that, take a look at that list, and look at the different ways that you can make your device safe, especially if you have an iOS device. This has been linked to the iPhone, the latest security update of the iPhone will help you get rid of that. But anyway, just to say that this spyware is being used to spy on our activist communities, SJP activists that are around the country, and it's being used to spy also on nonprofit staff. And that's one of the sources that, the Israeli government has cited for the secret evidence that they have on these organizations that they designated as terrorist. So I also want to highlight that this initiative has contracted with security volunteers or Israeli settlers to spy on Palestinians. There's this app called White Wolf that has been developed to scan a Palestinian ID card before Palestinians enter, a settlement for things like work. And that allows the settlers to really spy on Palestinians that have no choice but to work at the settlements. The last thing that I want to say is to really call for, whoever is listening to the website to really show solidarity to the 6 Palestinian civil society organizations that have been designated. This is a really high profile step in a long-running campaign by the Israeli government to silence critics of Israeli human rights violations in Palestine. And, this bogus designation really shows that Israel is desperate to silence and stop the work that these organizations have done throughout decades of exposing the Israeli government for what it is. It is an apartheid regime that engages in ongoing settler colonial violence against Palestinians, and that is trying to avoid accountability by silencing essential work from the Palestinian civil society organizations. So something that people can do is, one, just call for the US State Department, call, like your representatives. Again, electoral politics, I know it's weird and it will not liberate us, but really try to put some pressure on the decision makers in the country, in the US, so that they really push the Israeli government to walk back on this designation. And something else that I think people can do to show international support for these organizations is to elevate their public image, right? Some of these organizations are AMED, which works on political prisoner rights, Al-Haq, which works on international law and human rights, the United Agricultural Workers Union, which works on agriculture, and Defense for Children International Palestine, pretty self-explanatory. So if there are students listening to this, if there are activists listening to this, the next webinar that you have, maybe you can have a speaker from them, maybe you can, talk about their essential work at your schools, the more attention that we're giving them in a positive way to sort of highlight the important work that they do, recording, documenting, and then challenging Israelis' gross violations of human rights, the more that we help put them in the spotlight and ensuring that US-based organizations and the US government really that is funding this whole Israeli enterprise respond to calls for accountability. So I'd just like to end on that call for action from our comrades and supporters.
Okay, I'm back on. I'm sorry I got disconnected again, third time today, but I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Tomomi Kinukawa, who can actually also moderate the next round. We have 20 minutes, so the questions are okay, so we can actually make the connections around what we all have said. And I I really thank you, Luna, for mentioning the prisoners and for talking about NSO and Pegasus and so on, and showing how insidious these things are. I want to just go back and say that, yes, but how do we prevent ourselves from getting totally demoralized by all these big structures? So I'm going to pass it on to Tomomi. Hopefully I won't get cut off again. Tomomi.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, there are 20 minutes left. I think, so maybe just we should just go around and each of us could say how any kind of connections that we have seen, so maybe I have to translate for Mihye, so maybe someone else could start, and then we can go around. So should I? So maybe. Okay, thank you.
Sure. I always appreciate these roundtables that Professor Abdulhadi organizes, because it really reminds us that we are in it together. Really, that inextricability of justice comes to forth, because that Pegasus thing, designed by Israeli company, sold by Israeli company. There's so many Kashmiri journalists whose iPhones were found to be infected by Pegasus technology, and I send myself email. If I read an article, I send it to myself quite often. And sometimes it takes 2 or 3 days for me to get an article I have emailed to myself. So that tells you what's happening with my phone. And I change my laptop. So even right now, I have to be on another laptop because my laptops get infected by some garbage. And it is obviously coming from these sources. And I have been told, and I'm nothing. I'm literally nothing. And I've been told that every quarter, when the Indian embassy in DC reports back to India, it has a report on me. What have I done? Where have I talked? Which public event have I spoken on? And it used to it was like a source of I was surprised, but why would they do that? But now, after what has been happening so far, it makes sense. The RAW has, or the intelligence agency has, each and every detail. It has our addresses, our phone numbers, our private phone numbers, our private email addresses, not just the work email address. So it's super creepy. And the technology that Israel produces and sells, and India is the biggest purchaser of weapons and military technology from Israel, from the US, as well as from France and Russia. And so, you know, we're in it together because we are we are victimized by the same literal technology, right?
Thank you. Maybe can we go to Mihye? So can I speak in Japanese and then translate into English? Mihye-san, 私の役があんまりなんかうまくどのぐらい分かっていただけたか分かんないんですけれども、他の方たちとの仕事でどういうつながりを見るかということで、でもその在日の朝鮮人特にの問題をこういう場で語ることの重要性っていうようなことも含めてもう少し語っていただけたらいいんじゃないかなと思います。So I asked her to connect back and also ask like why we have to include Zainichi Chosenjin, Zainichi Korean in this conversation. Like I asked her about that connection too.
ともみさん率直に言うと、
はい、
このパネルでなんだろうな、こう在日朝鮮人の歴史をと思ったんですけれども、やっぱりその皆さんのお話を聞いていると、もっとこのすごくこう現場の課題みたいなものを、まあもちろん歴史的にそれぞれの地域がどういうふうに例えば、軍事的な暴力だとか、その資本主義的な植民地化とかいう問題といかにこうその現場の感覚として向き合ってこられたのかっていうことがすごい非常によく学べたというか圧倒されたというのが本音で、そのお話にどう私が今日準備してきたお話をこうまあ本当に仕事のつながりというか我々の課題のつながりをどう考えるかっていうことをずっと悩みながら聞いていました。ともみさんのそのトランスレーションも含めて。なんというか私は在朝鮮人としてで旧宗主国に生きているマイノリティとしてその世界史の皆さんとそれぞれの地域の本当に現代世界が抱えている問題の一部であるっていうふうに私も考えるんですが、具体的にどのような言語でどのように今日の課題の連帯っていうことも含めてしていくのがちょっと私自身はそういう課題に考えています。もちろん歴史的に朝鮮戦争の経験ですとか、あと韓国での米軍犯罪も含める米軍撤退運動ですとか、本当にたくさんの歴史があって、それは例えば韓国の運動の先端でやってきた方が今日ここでお話しすればもっと良かったんだろうなと思ったりもしましたし、でも在日朝鮮人の歴史の中にも反戦運動とかあったわけで、ただそれを私がちょっと今日自分の在日朝鮮人の歴史の問題としてちゃんとお話ができなかったのはちょっと残念だったかなというふうに反省しています。はい。
So I think what Mihye was pointing out is that it's the connection is yet to be made. Like that as living as a Zainichi Chosen, with the Zainichi Chosen and she's saying she's kind of I think it's partly it is also the issue of translation. The limit of my translation too, that we need more time to actually translate everything that this rich content to be translated. And then but then it is, she said it is very much inspiring and also overwhelming to hear all the struggles that they are going through, in terms of colonization, militarization, and so forth. And she does see the connection, but then that she doesn't have the language actually yet to articulate the connection. And then also there are a history of struggles by Zainichi, Chosenjin, Zainichi Koreans, and also in Korea too, like against the militarization, colonization. And like today, that was not part of what she or like we actually prepared. And so it was a little bit regretting that we were not able to actually offer the history. But but this has been really inspiring, and we are thinking about like how to connect, and so it's like to be continued, I think. So maybe Meira, could you?
Yes. So I'm thinking about the question that Rabab, Professor Abdulhadi has posed about what we can do in relation to the connection that we see. I think there were a couple of things that stood out from the questions that Rabab posed to me about what is an imperialist army, and thinking about the big powers using our own to oppress us, and Huma, Professor Dar's conversation about positionality, right? And this task of description versus task of liberation. You know, I think about the book project that I've been trying to land forever, right? In terms of like, what is the purpose of it, right? And if the design is to, you know, get an academic job and keep it, right? And that you have this academic audience versus the people you want to impact with the book, right? Whether it's the larger audience or even the people who are the, you know, my interlocutors within the text, right? So personally, I'm born and raised in Haiti, you know, and I have been embedded in movements in Haiti for a very long time now. So as somebody who came in as a graduate student, a researcher, but eventually as a collaborator, right? Because the lines got blurred about, well, is this research or am I doing this because there's an activist point to it, right? Towards liberation, towards resistance. So I wonder if in terms of the thing that we could all connect around is this issue of our positionality and doing our work, and the purpose of that work, right? In connection to this question about big powers using us to oppress us, right? Because I do have, depending on my audience, right? And this is the thing that I'm tackling with the book, right? Who am I speaking to? When I, as a Haitian American, when we're talking about what's happening in Haiti, we take the position, right, of talking about the core group, which is actually this political council, if you will, that has the UN, France, Canada, Germany, Spain, Brazil, and the US on it. And we critique them, right, as the imperialists. But within Haiti, Haitians are experiencing this imperialism, right, via their critique of the local state that is occupied by people who look like them, that, you know, that they have access to. So there's something, you know, I talk about this management of state abandonment, corruption, neoliberalism as something that's happening, even if it's unequal, right? That Haitians in Haiti will say we can't let off the hook those who look like us who oppress us, right? And simply look at them as puppets. There's something much more complicated there, that they are themselves invested, and we can talk about them as having, you know, being colonized themselves, but many of them are using the state and using others, right, to enrich themselves and to have access to capital in order to join, right, the ranks of the wealthy and powerful. Anyway, so I think there's something there that, in terms of positionality and this insider outsider conversation that we could have together, that I think would be rich and interesting.
If I can speak to that, Mamyrah, that is absolutely exactly. So that sensitivity to our positionality, who are we talking to? Where do we come from? Where do we owe our loyalties? Who are our people here? What are the conversations that need to happen within Haiti and with the people who look like us but are acting as puppets for the colonizers, puppets for, you know, incrementally genocidal colonial, powers, and the conversation about relegating the kind of degrees, the shades of responsibility. So, in my case, in the case of this scholar that I was talking about, she is an Indian, obviously, and some Kashmiris who have not read the book are just happy at the fact that she mentions occupation in the title. That is called the Occupied Clinic, because unlike Israel, which is naked in its genocidal intent, it is absolutely fascistically naked that it wants to genocide Palestinians and gobble up the whole land. In case of India, it is it's actually more difficult because it plays the game. It speaks with its forked tongue. It says Kashmir is an integral part of India and it loves us while it's killing us. You know, it's so and her work is looking at the place of the clinic, which we just needed to look at Foucault. There's nothing original. A 11-year-old kid on a Kashmiri street who has not gone to school for the last 2 years because of the politics in Kashmir will tell you that each and every sphere of our life is saturated by the militarization, occupation by India. Each and every, from education to from the primary schools to the universities to healthcare to love and desire. And as scholars, we know that. But because they're occupied people and it's a 436-year-old long history, so that even children are wise enough to understand that right away. So for this Indian scholar to come in and to point the fingers at Kashmiri therapists and psychiatrists and counselors to say, well, you know, they are still regenerating the colonial care in this, feels like that's not her place. That is not her place to do that. She needs to critique. She needs to do work on, tell us why the raw people have raped. What are their symptoms of PTSD? She assumes she wants to kind of consume us and our narratives. At one point, she asked, "Oh, am I feeling kamzor?" which is a Farsi word that means weakness, and it's a term that has been used by many Kashmiris. 400 plus years of occupation, and people feel helpless, they feel victimized and impotent. And so one of the words that we viewed and we feel this almost, it goes into the physicality of our being, that we feel helpless. And she says, am I feeling that? So this person whose father, got her BA and her PhD on his pocket in the US, and upper caste and upper class and a part of genocidal structure. She's asking if she's feeling control and impotent. It's actually obscene. To be honest, it's obscene, and it's not her position. And it's an obscenity for her to even participate in the conversation. It's for Kashmiris to critique and with love and to heal ourselves. And we have long histories of resisting the psychotherapy as the only mode of healing, especially with our Sufis. And there's in Kashmir particularly, there's a Sufi shrine in every block. And that is the source of the gross spiritual healing that happens for us, which is why we're still fighting. It's not the psychiatric clinic that we're still fighting. It's the Sufi shrine. It's our faith in our own humanity, in our own dignity, that we're still fighting.
I think Dr. Abdulhadi, would you like to? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, first I want to just say thank you to everybody. This has been so much food for thought, so there is no conclusion. I mean, trying to actually make a conclusion is a waste of time. I am thinking about one is that the politics of translation. So we have actually in everything, like 2 weeks ago, we did French, English. We've done a whole bunch of sessions, Arabic, English. Today, this morning, we had Arabic, English. Now we have Japanese, right? English. I think it's really important. I think it's very, very important device to resist and defy English being an imperial language. I think it takes more time, but I think it's really important to do so. I think. Secondly, I want to actually think about what lines are blurred, and are the lines blurred on our part or on their part, and who cares? And I'm saying this, who cares, not in terms of only activists. I'm talking about intellectually speaking. So I think, how do we do what we do? How do we how do we research what we do? And then the whole question of the native informant. I mean, Fanon spoke about that. Everybody spoke about that. We've had so many, Saeed spoke about that. There is so many native informers that again and again and again. And of course, the system needs native informers to succeed. It doesn't have native informers. It doesn't work. They have to get people like us to rubber stamp and say, this is okay. They have to. I mean, how else are they going to do it? Because they have no legitimacy anymore. Colonialism is exposed. Zionism is exposed. White supremacy is exposed. Hindutva is exposed. All of the stuff is exposed. They need to say there are people from us who come and rubber stamp. Maybe this is sort of quote unquote before the last frontier, and I'm using a colonial, terminology and put it in parentheses. But I think they're really desperate and they're losing, and this is why they're trying every trick in the book. I think it's very hard for us to recognize that sometimes. I know for me, it's very hard to recognize that sometimes. I mean, like being attacked again and again and again. But actually, really looking at it, why is it that they are so invested in crushing us? Why? Who are we? We're a bunch of scholars here, and they're talking. If we are not really that dangerous, why they're invested so much to crushing us? Why? And this is like really like, why don't you just leave us alone? Yell all we want, scream all we want, and so on and go on. Why? If we're not really representing a big threat and danger, because we are challenging minds, we are actually raising questions. They have a serious problem with it. So I think for me, I think it's a question of how do we do knowledge? How do we do what we do? I'm really, really very much interested in that. How do we do? And then we do the textured kind of like analysis. This is like Huma, what you said today. This is not in one place. It's scattered all over the place. How do you bring it in? Tomomi and I know a lot about what happens with the universities. Mamyrah, you know so much about the occupation. You've spoken about it again and again and again. Mihye, you're talking about what's going on with the whole denialism. That's kind of like Luna, you spoke about the whole question of the Zapatista and prisoners and Pegasus and so on. We have so much stuff, and Tomomi, all your research and my research and so on. There is so much stuff out there. I really think I kind of like want to hesitate to say that we should bring it all together, because when we bring it all together, it might reify. But I think maybe at some point that might actually be the thing that we need to do. Kind of like put it together, put something out there. You do your book, have representation. We have you all speak about your book, Mamyrah. Huma, you've been kind of like a trailblazer about all of this. I mean, I think this is what we really need to do again and again and again. And we need to make it possible for our students, for our colleagues, for our communities to actually understand and accept that this is really validated. This is legitimized form of knowledge production. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges, because again and again and again, what we say and we produce, because we're so much invested, because we're so accountable to our communities, is dismissed as not real knowledge compared with the colonial knowledge. And what you're talking about, Huma, I mean, I can give you how many thousands of examples that happens by Israeli scholars. I'm not talking about all of them, because a lot are comrades, a lot are anti-Zionists, a lot are working with us on the same project. But this happens again, and it happens by our own people too. So I think kind of like, how do we do this? And sometimes it gets sickening, but I think this is a discussion that's actually going to be very useful for our students, for ourselves, to think about that and think about, okay, so what are the next steps? How do we do this? Are we in for another Teaching Palestine? I mean, I'll be in touch with all of you. If you're interested, send me abstract, because we are organizing a very major international conference on Teaching Palestine. Irrespective of what FSFSU likes or it doesn't like, that's their problem. We don't care. We do whatever we need to do. So I think this is really great. For me, I'm very grateful. I learn so much from everybody, and I just love. There's so much energy. It's just finished before we have even started. So I'm going to turn it back to Tomomi to sign off and do whatever conclusions you need to do.
Well, I agree with you that there's no conclusion, and I think this is to be continued. And I think the question about translation, I think I'd like to think about it too, and like how we set this up too, like that this particular space, like it's how we translate in this weird space, and so like there are so much work to do, and I really like I'm very much grateful for everyone to be like for sharing here, work here, and I hope that this will continue in the future. So thank you so much.
And I just want to say thank you to Lais for being there, for doing all the technical things, for making it sound so seamless and so easy. That's when it's really great, when you actually feel there are no problems whatsoever. Because as of this morning, we thought we're going to have huge crashes. So Light made it all happen. So thank you so much, Light. This is really great.
Thank you very much, everyone, especially Professor Abdulhadi and Professor Kinukawa. It was a pleasure to be here and to hear from Mihye and Mamyrah and Luna. Just amazing. And I love the way our conversations go, because I think this is it. This is knowledge production. Even coming here to speak together is knowledge production. Being open towards each other, we are role modeling what, you know, good, I mean, I shouldn't say good, what responsible, accountable scholarship should be like, being answerable to each other.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
I love you all.
I love you all. It's so great to have you shine, you know. This is amazing. Yeah, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Thank you. Okay,
Thank
take
you
care.
so much.